Nearly 6 years ago, I put together my Tiny Pentium system, a jam-packed machine with a 200 MHz Pentium MMX, 128 megabytes of RAM, and a Voodoo 2. Over time, I augmented it with an All-Real Vortex 2, Dream Blaster X2 MIDI card, and solid-state storage that have made it an absolutely fantastic machine. After I built it, though, I moved my video work into a dedicated office space where all of my computers went, except for one. Having that machine at home, with it being so small and so feature-dense, has been a huge benefit. But it is still limited, and I got to thinking, what if I built it some friends? And so began my months-long quest that resulted in me building 2 more excellent machines that I'm going to cover the entire and sometimes custom builds for here. You know, I sure do have a lot of games back there. It's weird how I never do anything with them, isn't it? Well, that ends now, because today I'm announcing the launch of a brand new channel, Tech Tangents Gaming. I've released 4 new videos over there that cover not only PC games, but console and ROM hacks. And videos recorded using the machines we're going to be building today are already featured over there, with some more coming soon. I'm doing fully scripted reviews with my own insight and opinions on game design and a focus on covering full playthroughs. So if that sounds interesting, I'll leave a link down below. Now, back to the builds. In the video where I built the Tiny Pentium, I mentioned that it met the minimum specs for many games I enjoy. Well, it didn't end up working out as well as I'd hoped in the long run. Between it technically having 2 3D GPUs messing with some games and other games being overly optimistic about their performance, it was easier to find its limits than I thought. And its limit is basically DirectX. Anything that can natively use the Voodoo 2 in Glide works great, but if it has to go through DirectX first, the performance falls off a cliff. So it's ended up just being relegated to what I would call a Windows 95 and DOS gaming system, covering the early 3D stuff, but it's also able to scale back to older games as well. This left me wanting a machine that could play those DirectX games again, though. And I really wanted something that was about the same size as the Tiny Pentium. However, I didn't want to build a system from scratch. That wouldn't be small enough for what I wanted. So I started looking at small form factor PCs. And I remember Dell especially made a lot of systems like that. So I started cataloging and cross-referencing different models to settle what on an ideal model for me would be. While snooping eBay and building the list, I started talking to some friends about it and was pointed towards Shuttle as a potential system maker also. They specialized in boutique higher-end systems that have become very collectible now, and the cheapest ones were more than double what I was looking at paying for the Dells. They were all also mostly later than I was thinking I wanted to aim for too. But then I had a realization. What I really wanted wasn't a replacement for the Tiny Pentium. It was miniaturized versions of my Windows 98 and Windows XP 20th anniversary builds. I needed to build 2 machines, not 1. Doing that would much better fit hardware to the games that I have. So that reframed the plan and made me immediately settle on what one of the machines I wanted was. This is a Dell Optiplex GX110, but that's not the whole story. When Dell started making full custom mainstream machines, they were trying to be smart about it and design them to come in different variants. This started with the GX1 systems that came with a hideous tower version, a true desktop, which actually featured in a cameo video that was actually a prototype for me making this channel. But the GX1s were also available in a small form factor too. And if I understand the manuals correctly, all 3 machines use the exact same motherboard, and the difference is mostly down to a daughter board that adds ISA and PCI slots. The GX110 series was a fairly small revision that bumped up the specs a little bit but kept the rest of the design. Now the key difference between the first generation machines like this and the later black ones is that the first ones can use full-size add-in cards, unlike the later ones that can only use half height. So they are much more flexible, but less powerful. There's also a bit of a gamble with them. The GX110 machines come in slot 1 or slot 370. I'm not sure if there's a way to tell which it is from the outside. They also came in many different configurations, and some may not have all of the options, like onboard sound. This was all stuff that I researched before I bought this example, and I was able to get one with everything I wanted, like onboard USB, LAN, and sound. And sound is the most important because all of these are limited to 2 PCI slots. So if onboard sound is acceptable, that would give me a usable free slot. However, the attentive among you may have noticed that I didn't say it has AGP, because it doesn't, which really handicaps what you can put in here. I do have a plan for that, but I want to get back to that in a moment, because while I was waiting on the delivery of this computer, I was trying to come up with a different solution for a Windows XP computer. My overall goal is to have 3 different machines with a small amount of compatibility overlap between them to run the games on the hardware that they best match. But Windows XP comes with a lot of changes to the operating system, and using NT, it makes a pretty clean break. And since Windows Vista was so poorly received that hardware vendors even offered an XP downgrade, the maximum hardware you can run on XP is a lot later than most other OSs. And you know what the best kind of hardware is? Free. This is a Dell 7040 small form factor business computer with an i5 6500 and half-height PCI slots. Now, this is an unusual hardware choice for me because this is far from period accurate and not the kind of thing I would normally pick. However, free. I rescued this computer from e-waste and have been trying to find a use case for it, so I thought I would at least give it a shot because free, and if it did actually work with Windows XP, it would be a whole lot more powerful than I would ever need. Now, there is a whole Renaissance side to Windows XP that I've never really investigated much because I generally prefer to run on period correct hardware with drivers on some sort of plastic media. But there are groups out there who try to stretch Windows XP to run on hardware it was very much not intended to. And my thought was, if I could get XP to run on this, it would be practically unlimited performance. Long story short though, this hardware appears to be nearly the exact limit where XP can no longer be installed. The problem is down to the peripheral drivers. This has an Intel Q170 chipset, and if I remember right, after getting XP installed, I had no USB, no LAN, no sound, and basically no way to get data onto or off of the computer reasonably without opening it up and removing the boot drive. Windows 7 was the oldest officially supported operating system for this machine. I even tried installing Vista on it for kicks and ran into the exact same problems. Windows 7 is where I draw the line because that is just far too abstracted from what I'm trying to do here. But right as I was writing off the Dell 7040, a stroke of luck, and my local friend Dziak managed to find not 1, but 2 Shuttle PCs for basically free. And I ended up with all of the hardware from them and the more era-appropriate case. Except, they have some huge problems to solve, and I want to go back to the GX110 a while I mull over those. Now, after the GX110 was delivered, I immediately tore into it to check it over. I wasn't really planning on this being a video at this point because, in theory, I should just be able to add in a video card and be off to the races for gaming. But I should have realized that that's never how these things go. So for now, I have mostly photos. The capacitors in this computer look perfect, which was a relief. This precedes the cat plague, so I was optimistic it would be fine, but it was good to confirm. The config of this particular machine also has the fastest offered CPU, thankfully a socket 370 Pentium 3 at 733 MHz. The amount of RAM it came with didn't really matter because I was ready to max it out at 512 megabytes as soon as I opened it. The machine also takes a full-size 3.5-inch hard drive, full-size 3.5-inch floppy drive, and a slimline optical drive. And it has the 2 PCI slots that I mentioned on the daughter board. It's overall nowhere near as cramped inside as the Tiny Pentium, but that's also because it's just much bigger. I knew going into this that it was going to be impossible to get the new machines down to this size because, well, it's a bad idea. These get a lot hotter. But still, it's pretty darn compact. Thankfully, when I put power to it, it also booted up with no problems at all. Well, posted without any problems. The hard drive had been removed before I got it, and I couldn't get the slimline optical drive to work. I immediately suspected it was dead though, because I had the exact same problem on the Tiny Pentium. So I grabbed a full-size drive and was able to get it to boot. I slapped in a quick hard drive and it was doing great. For giggles, the test hard drive had Ubuntu 12.04 on it, which totally worked. And this is where I introduced my genius plan. Before I even bought the GX110, I'd actually already bought 2 brand new in-box GeForce 6200 PCI cards in anticipation that I wouldn't be able to find a system that could use AGP. So now that the hardware was known to work, I was ready to open one up and make this machine a monster. The cards box does warn about needing 300 watts, and the SFX power supply in this is below that number, but That number is wrong because it doesn't take external power and you can't pull that much through the PCI slot. So everything should be good, except it wasn't. And why was a complete mystery. Windows 98 does not truly support multiple GPUs, and this computer has an onboard Intel video card, so it boots up to that by default. Using that, I was able to install the NVIDIA drivers and the 6200 worked, except the Intel card was still working too, and Windows 98 would always default to using the Intel card. That's fine, it's happening because the BIOS is setting the Intel card as the primary, so all I need to do is go into the BIOS and set the 6200 to be primary, and it just hangs here. This is unsolvable, but I do want to shout out the members of the Retro Dreams Discord server that helped me out with ideas on debugging this because I tried a lot. I disabled all of the other PCI devices. I updated the BIOS. I swapped slots. I changed IRQs every possible way. Nothing would solve it. The drivers were perfectly happy. It seems like there's just some kind of low-level hardware incompatibility between that card and this machine. So I had to give up on that card and bought an FX 5200 to replace it. I really didn't need the box, but the eBay listing showed the specs, and let me see that this was a 128-bit card, so boxed example it was. I popped that card in and it just worked. No weird setups, no other problems. The 6200 is just incompatible for some reason. Now during this, I had also replaced the slimline drive, but for some inexplicable reason, that was also incompatible, even though it's just an IDE drive. And that drive even worked with an adapter on another system. Now I'll mention that I'm specifically going for DVD drives, not because that I want to watch DVDs or think that there are Windows 98 DVD titles that I'm going to want to run on here. It's because DVD drives will have been made later than the CD drives, because so far the sample set is a 100% failure rate for slimline CD drives for me. So I was hoping going for a later slimline DVD drive would last longer. And also the DVD drives came in black, which just looks better with the weird gray accents this thing has on the front. With all of the weird problems that I'm encountering with this thing, I'm beginning to think that it's a little cursed. Well, actually maybe a lot cursed, because have you noticed anything odd about the internals of this machine? There are no fans. The singular exhaust fan in the whole machine is one next to the power supply that pushes through it and out to a free vent on the other side. There is zero actual airflow in this machine because that fan can also just pull air in from the other side of the case next to the hard drives, which might have been fine without any cards and a light load, but I wanted to game and with a passively cooled high power GPU. And this thing got hot, absolutely unacceptably hot. I added a fan to the graphics card, but it didn't matter because the air never leaves this thing. And there's nowhere to add fans. Well, maybe there's somewhere I could add a fan, but that was a whole other complicated thing. So for now, let's check back in on the Shuttle, which also has cooling problems. So the Shuttle was a disheveled heap and total mess of a computer. The power supply was dead. The optical drive was stuck. The caps were leaking. And worst of all, the proprietary CPU cooler was missing. The Shuttle XPC was a prominent line of small form factor computer chassis. They featured custom motherboards, a custom case, provided full customer support and drivers. But they were not intended to be turnkey systems though. They are a bare bones system meant to be more of a launch point for users to build from. The particular machine I have here was even touted as being the most powerful small form factor system on Earth. This tight level of integration came with some trade-offs though, and the cooler was a significant one. There is very little space between the removable drive cage and the CPU. Shuttle's solution to this problem was to make a custom heat pipe cooler that relocated the radiator to the back of the machine. This provided clearance for the drives and more directly exhausted heat from the system. The one that should have been included with this machine was so good, it was even offered as an upgrade for owners of older systems. But try as I might, I could not find one. I have literally no idea what the former owner would have done with two of these. So I was on my own for cooling, which was a big problem, but thankfully not an unsolvable one. I started reading up on period correct coolers and reviews to see what my options were, but in the meantime, I needed a stopgap solution. And now we can go into more detail on what this machine is. This is a Shuttle SB61G2. a socket 478 Pentium 4 machine with AGP. Except, not anymore. The second motherboard came from a Shuttle SB75 G2, which is nearly a straight chipset upgrade and nothing more. You'd have to look pretty hard to even see a difference between the two motherboards. But if you do look, you may see that the original board's caps are bad, but the newer ones are not. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that one. This chipset also allows the machine to use newer processors, and interestingly, fitted in this board already was a Pentium 4 3.2 GHz hyper-threaded CPU, except the actual one was an engineering sample. A pretty awesome chip for this that I will definitely be leaving in it. Now, I have plenty of socket 478 systems I can pilfer a cooler from for this chip, but the drive cage won't clear it. So while testing, I was running it both driveless and with a very hacky method to mount the drive. The next problem was that the original 200-watt power supply in the system was toast. I could recap this, but I vastly prefer to replace power supplies from this era if I can. And thankfully, this is actually a Flex ATX form factor power supply that I can get a modern version of. So I ordered a 500-watt FS group model. I chose this exact one because it has the most powerful 5-volt rail, even more than the 650-watt model. 5-volt power is a lot more important for these systems, so that was my sole deciding factor. With that and a cooler, I was now finally able to test if this machine would work, and thankfully, it does. Dodged a bullet with those capacitors, but I did actually order a full cap set if it does ever go belly up. Next up, the GPU. But I wasn't particularly keen on ordering a bunch more parts from eBay for this thing after the GX110 problems. So I scounged around for parts and didn't find a whole lot for high-end AGP cards, but I had set aside an ATI card based on the sole criteria of it being red because I was thinking it might be fun to make an all-red vintage AMD build sometime, but it turns out that was a Radeon X800 Pro, which is an extremely good AGP card. So rip AMD build because this thing has found a higher calling. With that, the XPC was now mostly usable and I could start testing it. While that was going on, I finally had a plan to tackle cooling on the GX110. So let's get back to that. The airflow in the GX110 is garbage and there aren't many options to fix it. There's some random air holes above the CPU, almost usable 60mm-ish vent on the left, and then the right, which is the only exhaust through the power supply. But even that isn't good because there's a huge gap between the power supply and the vent for the hot air to just blow back into the case instead of out of it. This is garbage, genuinely. This is terrible, and I don't think it moves any air through the important hardware at all. So I decided to completely re-engineer how cooling works in this. I modeled the machine loosely in Blender so that I could think this through, and I had a few ideas. One fundamental part of my plan was to take a page from later Dell machines that would use a plastic shroud for air ducting. So I was planning on adding something like that. Since there's only one vent in the back, my idea was to surround the CPU and the vent and then put a fan on the shroud that could blow over the GPU. This would act as an actual intake for the machine, which it didn't have initially. Then I had two ideas how to handle the front. The simplest option was to mostly leave the front the same, but block the front left air vent completely so air could only be drawn from the back. Alternatively, I could flip the fan on the power supply to pull cooler air in over it first, and then exhaust all of the air through the front left instead. But there are two problems with that. One is competing intakes for the single exhaust, which could lead to imbalanced airflow again. I wasn't crazy about that. But there's one more problem with the second design from a practicality standpoint. I couldn't put the case on its side anymore because it would block a vent no matter what. So I settled on the first design. But before I went all in on it, I figured I should do some CFD first to get a feel for how it would behave. That's right, a cardboard first draft. Actually, I was pretty confident in my plan and had ordered everything I needed before I even started on this. My plan was to use sheets of PET that I could cut, score, and bend to make the ducting. Sure, I could have 3D printed this, but this was actually faster and more temp stable. I started with a paper cutout so that I could trim and shape it down as I went along. Again, the idea is to completely cover the CPU and the rear vent, so cool air must be pulled over it by the side-mounted fan. After I made a rough paper template, I cut it out of cardboard, mounted the fan, and folded it together. The shape needed a little tweaking, but I could get a sense of how it would work now. I sealed the front left with packing tape and made a gasket around the power supply exhaust so it couldn't just roll back into the case anymore. As I went along, I found only one clearance problem that I had to really be concerned about. The lid of the case has a spar on it to make it stronger to support a monitor on top. My shroud ended up pushing right up against that, but it did fit. Before I moved on to the final version, I tried to get a sense of how much air this is moving by comparing the original setup by having it blow against a string, but it really wasn't conclusive. I think I would need the other kind of CFD to really know. But it definitely wasn't worse, so I went ahead with the final PET version. It was much more difficult to cut this than I expected, and I wish I had a better tool for this, but I was able to make do. And in the end, man, it turned out well. There is one mistake where I slipped while cutting the circle, but other than that, I don't think I could be happier with it. Now the real question though, did it help? I decided to heat soak the system using Unreal Tournament 2004, which was my high-end performance goal for the system. I ran it with a static scene and the new cooling while monitoring it with my thermal camera until the external temperature of the case reached a stable temperature and stopped rising. Now I'm going to state this directly. I am intentionally recording these in Fahrenheit because I don't want these values to be confused with the kinds of readings that you would get from in-die temp sensors because I cannot measure the parts like that on this machine. These readings are not directly comparable to those, so I'm trying to make it distinct. Now from my readings, the case reached a temp of 93.5 Fahrenheit after about 20 minutes before opening it. When I opened it, the GPU was 121 Fahrenheit, and oddly the chipset was the next hottest thing at 133 degrees Fahrenheit. I then reran the exact same test without the shroud and removed my front left seal. I left the power supply gasket and the GPU fan though. I ended up aborting the test after only 10 minutes though, because it exceeded the external case temperature of that first test and in half the time, and I did not want to risk damaging any of the parts. The readings were 94.5 degrees Fahrenheit on the case, 136 Fahrenheit on the GPU, and 143 Fahrenheit on the chipset. Noticeably higher temperatures, but again, in less than half the time. But also notice how much more heat the machine exhausted out with the ducted version and how much more heat contrast there is in the original. The hot parts just keep getting hotter. So I'm calling the cooler a complete success here. And with that, the GX110 is complete. Now, let's see if we can have as positive a result with the Shuttle. After looking at socket 478 coolers, I narrowed my choices down to a handful of low-profile aftermarket coolers. I was looking for something that was full copper for thermal conductivity and something with a small mounting footprint. Because another problem is that the cooler can intrude into the area around it, and there's not a lot of space in there. This is complicated by basically needing the cooler to be brand new as well to make sure that I get all of the mounting hardware. So it wasn't an easy search. Eventually, I found the perfect one listed on eBay though, a Spire model that would hopefully fit. But the other problem I needed to solve was the optical drive. I mentioned that the one that it came with was dead. Well, it might have worked, but the rubber part of the disc clamp melted into the disc that was left in the drive and was ripped apart when I tried to remove the disc. The laser may have also bit the dust based on the ring that you can see on the disc. And I really didn't like this HP OEM drive that was used, but at least it was silver. There aren't a lot of options for silver drives to match machines like this. So I ended up looking at contemporary reviews and builds to see what drives people with these went for. In the end, the answer was the same drive that I went for with my 20th anniversary XP build, a Sony DRU drive. That's what everyone back then used because it at least had a little bit of silver, but it was also one of the best drive models around. Now I managed to get a later, faster model that didn't have the blue accents to match even better, and with that, I was ready to solve the Shuttle. I pulled out all of the stuff that I had in there for testing, and yes, I'll get back to that SSD. The first thing I want to get installed is the cooler, because even though it uses a very small copper core like I was after, the fan is still fairly large. But the bigger problem though were the latches. Socket 478 has a plastic frame that the cooler clips onto, and the latches for the user to install it were overhanging the PCI slot. Worse though, the latches also intruded into the space for the power supply. I attempted applying a bit of pressure to bend them upright, but the metal was far more brittle than I expected, and one of the tabs that holds the latch to the tension bar snapped off. Thankfully, it would still work with that damage, but this wasn't a problem I could ignore. It's impossible to mount the power supply like this. So I verified that the cooler does clear the drive cage and did the only sensible thing. I grabbed them off. I feel a little bad about this because I'm basically destroying this thing when it was brand new, but there just aren't a lot of options that are compatible with this system, and I'm not going to be able to find that original cooler. Thankfully, that worked though, and I only did one side because I'm not currently planning on running any PCI cards in this thing. This let me mount the power supply, and the cooling was finally solved in a way that didn't compromise the rest of the system. Now I'll mention I did toss a Noctua fan on the back, but I might actually replace it with a higher CFM one later because the other fans in this are super loud already, and it gets a bit toastier than I would like. The Spire cooler actually came with a potentiometer that you can mount in a slot in the back to control its speed, but I'm not taking any chances and I'm just running it full tilt all the time. Now that there's room with that cooler though, I can install the DVD drive. I ended up getting another brand new one this time. Again, not intentionally. It was just that all of the open box examples on eBay had the drives that the owners replaced in them instead, and all of the used examples were extremely yellowed or missing the silver faceplate. So, knew it was. The optical drive and hard drive mount in a removable subframe that I can then slot into the case from the back. And oh man, this was my first time seeing the machine with a proper drive and the filler plate installed. It looks so much better now. To finish it up, I just needed to route the audio cable from the motherboard to the drive and connect it to IDE. Little fun fact, the Shuttle actually comes with a slightly special IDE cable that is meant to tuck in along a rail and be managed through tabs and slots. It works extremely well for such a tiny system. I'll also mention sometime along the way, I dropped in more RAM than this will ever need. 2 GB is a ton for a system like this, so it's not very hard to max it out. Then the SSD goes back in, which is pretty special. This is a Samsung 850 Pro. And this is one of the only SSDs that you can install actual trim support for in Windows XP. That means that I don't have to worry about the drive slowly nuking itself while being run in this computer because I can run the Samsung Magician software to run trim so that it can sort itself out. I'm really glad that I had some of those that I could put in here because that really makes this machine a whole lot easier and faster to use. I will apologize that I'm just wedging the SSD between the top of the case and the drive, but I'm leaving a 3.5-inch bay free for the potential of adding a drive emulator later. And with that, the Shuttle is now done as well. Oh yeah, I did have to tape back on a couple of heat sinks that were knocked off, but that was no big deal. But with that, both systems are now totally finished. And I do mean totally. Before, I found matching peripherals for the Tiny Pentium, but I'm not going to do that again here. The whole reason I'm going for such small machines is so that I can fit them in tighter spots at home, and frankly, I'm just using them with modern displays and peripherals through a RetroTink 4K and a KVM, so it's really not needed here. But I have been using these systems a bunch now, and they are perfect. Let's start with the GX110. Like I mentioned, my performance target with this machine was Unreal Tournament 2004. I didn't actually want to play something that new on this, but I wanted it to have that much headroom for games that run poorly, especially with the GPU being choked through PCI. With more reasonable titles, it works great though. The Tiny Pentium was a weird mix of either being hard bottlenecked by the GPU or the CPU. Something like Zoo Tycoon that seemed simple ran terribly because it was CPU locked, and something more intense like Draken also ran terribly, but because it was GPU bound. Both of those games run great on the GX110 though. Actually though, Draken was the game that made me want to do these builds. I've been wanting to try it out for a long time now, and I've finally been able to. It's one of the games that I have a full review of and summarized playthrough on the new gaming channel if you want to check it out. Now I was on the fence about adding an Aureal Vortex to the system with the free PCI slot, and while that might have given it some more post-processing capabilities, the onboard analog SoundMax chip seems perfectly serviceable, so I'm going to continue with that for now. I don't need more advanced MIDI or better DAW support because that's what the Tiny Pentium is already great at. And being able to delegate uses to each machine like that is exactly what I was after. Now, let's take a look at the Shuttle in action though. I will admit, I wish this was slightly newer. An LJ775P4 with a PCI graphics card would have been a lot better for just a little bit more performance headroom, especially price-wise. I lucked out having the GPU I did because high-end AGP cards for a system like this are desirable now, and I'm really not interested in spending $300+ on a video card for this. Thankfully, by sheer coincidence, this machine did meet my performance goal though, at least on paper, because I wanted to be able to run Crysis on this. And a P4, 3.2 gigahertz, and ATI X800 Pro are the exact minimum system requirements, at least for Vista. XP is technically a little bit lower, but let's just say when the video about playing that game on this machine comes out, you won't be thinking it was overpowered. For less crazy performance targets though, it is an absolute champ. I can totally see why the shuttles are so revered now, even though this one is a bit of a Frankenstein now. I am so happy with how these two machines have turned out. They do everything I was hoping for and more. A fun little side note here. The Tiny Pentium is 200 megahertz. The GX110 is practically 800 megahertz. And the Shuttle is 3200 megahertz. By sheer coincidence, each one of them is exactly 4 times higher clocked than the next. And while I could possibly eke out a little more performance with some upgrades, I think they're perfect as they are. But I am super excited to have these machines, and they will be getting a lot of use going forward. Between the 3 of them, I should be able to run almost every single physical PC game I own on real hardware that all fits together in a very compact space. Though, I will probably use DOSBox with the Tiny Pentium for games that have speed issues, but I still will be able to leverage its real MIDI hardware with that. But that's it for now. I'm going to plug the new gaming channel one last time here though, and it is linked down below. But if you enjoyed this video, you may want to subscribe to be notified when I release more of them. If you want to help support the channel, you can find me on Patreon, but for now, that's it, and I will see you next time.